How much wood would a woodchuck chuck if Chuck would wood?
Who's Chuck Wood?
Would Chuck wood if Chuck would chuck wood?
Could Chuck? No. Could Chuck wood? But the real question is, would Chuck wood?
I'm trying to figure out if Chuck would chuck wood.
Oh. Would Chuck wood?
If Chuck would could Chuck would.
Would Chuck wood? If Chuck would, could Chuck would?
But then that also begs the question, should Chuck would?
Okay, hold up. Should Chuck would? Would Chuck would?
Like,
Chuck
even if
would.
Chuck would could Chuck would, I don't know if Chuck would Chuck would.
Okay. If Chuck would, could Chuck would? Would Chuck would Chuck?
If Chuck Wood had a woodchuck.
If Chuck Wood had a woodchuck, Chuck would. So stupid, bruh. If Chuck Wood went out woodchucking, Chuck would.
That's what I've been trying to figure out this whole time. Because I'm like, I don't know.
Should Chuck would.
If
'Cause I don't know.
should Chuck would Chuck good would if Chuck would could Chuck would. That doesn't mean he would Chuck would.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, could Chuck would if Chuck Wood wanted to Chuck Wood?
Well, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Like, I just don't know. And even if he could, I don't know if he should.
I don't think Chuck Wood should Chuck Wood if Chuck Wood could Chuck Wood.
Yeah,
I mean,
I don't think I would if I was Chuck Wood.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too. Can Chuck would if Woodchuck could Chuck Wood? If a woodchuck
Yeah,
could
if
Chuck
a wood could Chuck would, could Chuck would.
If a woodchuck could, okay.
That
if
just
a
opened. That
woodchuck-
just begs a whole other
Yeah.
question. That, like, I don't even know if we're
If-
ready for.
Listen. If a woodchuck would, should Chuck would?
I just don't even know at that point. Cause like at that point, like if a woodchuck could do it, why can't he? You know?
Yeah. Why would Chuck would if a woodchuck would just Chuck wood for him? That's the question on everybody's mind.
Leave your answers in the comments.
Yes. Should Chuck would if a woodchuck would? Or Chuck would.
Well, now, like, hold on. Even if a woodchuck could chuck wood, like, woodchuck would be able to chuck more wood than the woodchuck.
Well, okay, I think it's less of a question of that and more of a question if should Chuck would if a woodchuck could chuck wood for Chuck wood. I think that's the question.
Yeah, but like we still don't even know if he could, and even if he could, we don't know if he would.
No, you're right.
'Cause I'm just
So
saying, like, woodchuck would chuck wood if he had a woodchuck to chuck wood for Chuck Wood.
I don't think Chuck would chuck wood if he had a woodchuck that chuck wood for Chuck Wood.
Yeah, because I feel
I
like if
think
he had the
Chuck would.
woodchuck to do it for him, like, he wouldn't have any
I
reason to
think
chuck his
Chuck-
own wood.
Look, I think Chuck would have a woodchuck chuck his wood for, Chuck Wood.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too, but also it's like, should Chuck Wood use the woodchuck to chuck wood for Chuck Wood?
I don't know. I think Chuck should. I think Chuck Wood should woodchuck, even if a woodchuck would chuck wood for chuck wood, he still
Yeah,
should.
that's what I was thinking. But then that like begs a whole new question. Like, who could chuck more wood, the woodchuck or Chuck Wood?
Chuck wood. No, woodchuck.
Well, like,
No.
woodchuck would chuck more wood if the woodchuck could chuck wood.
I don't know. I think woodchuck would chuck more wood if the woodchuck could chuck more wood than chuck wood.
That's what I'm trying to figure
No.
out. Like,
Okay, hold on. Woodchuck would chuck wood if the woodchuck could chuck more wood than chuck wood would.
See, now you
That's
got me
the question.
thinking. Like, I'm not too sure about that. Because I feel like if the
Yeah.
woodchuck could chuck wood, the woodchuck would chuck more wood than chuck wood.
Yeah, me too, honestly.
What do you think, Mateo?
Bro, I just got back and I have to go. I'm getting called back already,
So stupid.
so I'm
right?
not in this conversation.
Hold on, this whole thing begs another question, dude.
What's the question?
If Chuck Berry could bury Chuck.
From Chuck Wood?
Wait, if Chuck Berry buried Chuck Wood. Wait, would Chuck Berry bury Chuck Wood if Chuck Wood's woodchuck chucked Chuck Berry?
Oh, man. So hold on. The question is, would Chuck Berry chuck
No, I'm saying
His
would
own
would
woodchuck?
Chuck Berry bury Chuck Wood if Chuck Wood's woodchuck chucked Chuck Berry?
if Chuck Wood's woodchuck chucks Chuck Berry?
I'm asking if
If the-
Chuck Berry would bury Chuck Wood if that happened.
Oh, I don't know. I think Chuck Berry, while eating berries, would get chucked by Chuck Wood's woodchuck into a pile of wood. And the question stands, would Chuck Berry bury the woodchuck that belongs to Chuck Wood after Chuck Wood's woodchuck chucked Chuck Berry into wood?
Well, I think Chuck Berry would bury Chuck Wood in the woods, cause Chuck Wood's woodchuck chucked Chuck Berry in a pile of wood while eating berries.
Okay. So, I think Chuck Berry finds berries in the woods that belong to the that belong to Chuck Wood's woodchuck. And because Chuck Berry ate the wood berries, the woodchuck that belongs to Chuck would chuck Chuck Berry into some wood in the woods.
Alright. Well, would Chuck Berry chuck Chuck Berry if Chuck Berry was made of wood?
Would Chuck Berry chuck Chuck Berry if Chuck Berry was made of wood? Ah, man, I don't know. Should Chuck Berry chuck Chuck Berry if Chuck Berry's made of wood?
That begs the question. And if Chuck Berry did chuck Chuck Berry because Chuck Berry was made of wood, what would Chuck Wood's woodchuck do?
What would Chuck Berry's woodchuck do?
Oh my gosh, bro. I wonder what like the freaking AI summary of this video would be.
I don't know, bro. That's a good ass question, though.
Dude,
What
I kind of
would
want
The
to.
AI summary for Chuck Wood's woodchuck be?
Would the AI summary for Chuck Wood's woodchuck?
Video.
So stupid, bro. I almost want to upload it just to see.
Would Chuck Berry's woodchuck Chuck Wood if Woodchuck Berry... No, wait. Wouldn't Chuck Berry chucked Chuck Berry's woodchuck that used to belong to Woodchuck?
Hold on. Well, Wouldn't Chuck Woods wouldn't Chuck Wood?
I don't know. Who is Wooden Chuck? New character, bro.
So stupid, bro.
Oh my gosh. Wooden Chuck, Chuck Berry. No, wait. Wooden Chuck, Chuck Berry's woodchuck. If Chuck Berry could Chuck Woods woodchuck.
Yeah,
Now
I
there's
don't
like
know.
4 different entities. There's Wooden Chuck, Chuck Wood, Chuck Woods woodchuck, and Chuck Berry.
Honestly, we should give away like $1 million to someone who could answer every question we pose in this video.
We should.
Logically, they can't just say whatever. It has to make sense.